After looking into why Dumbledore let a young Tom Riddle learn at Hogwarts, I found myself wondering what he had thought of Voldemort at different points in their lives. What did he think of Tom Riddle when he was at Hogwarts, when he started working at Borgin and Burke's, even before the war? Obviously, first and foremost, Dumbledore views Voldemort as a threat, and he dedicates his life to just stopping him, stopping his pureblood movement, but at the same time, I think there's enough evidence in their own interactions to suggest that there's more than just a purely adversarial relationship here. Obviously, it's not going to be as deep as Dumbledore's relationship with Grindelwald, but it seems like something's there.
Who will love you now, Dumbledore?
Don't worry, Gellert. It won't be Tom. And I know I've spent a lot of time on these two as I've argued that Voldemort not only doesn't fear Dumbledore, but needed him for his plans to take over, and that Dumbledore made a conscious decision letting a young Tom Riddle learn at Hogwarts in spite of any risk. But for full details on those, see my published works. But I want to look beyond that first interaction at Wool's orphanage as we try to answer, what did Dumbledore think of him while he was at Hogwarts, or after he opened the Chamber of Secrets? What was his reaction to finding out he was working at Borgin and Burke's, or even before he emerges as Lord Voldemort interviewing before the war begins? So I want to start in Half-Blood Prince as Dumbledore is showing Harry the memories he's acquired of Voldemort's past, and specifically I'm going to start with the memories he has of the Gaunt family as he shows Harry the abusive conditions that Voldemort's mother grew up in, but then at the same time letting him know that, hey, she then proceeded to use a love potion on a muggle, and after abusing him for years, seemingly, with it, he is lifted from the spell and abandons his wife and child. It's a terrible situation, but you understand why. But then it leads to Merope becoming depressed and not wanting to use magic, as Dumbledore says that she wouldn't even lift a wand to save her own life. And when Harry acts shocked that Merope wouldn't even stay alive for her own son, Dumbledore, he doesn't react like, oh my god, you feel sorry for Voldemort? Harry, this is Voldemort. Think of everything he's done. No, he's talking to him in a calm, gentle tone.
Harry, you put your name in a goblet of fire.
Great man, Dumbledore. Good bedside manner. But, in this conversation, he's really quite impressed with Harry that after everything Voldemort has done to him, he still has the ability to feel sorry for him, which, of course, Harry denies, because at this point in the story, he still sees the world pretty black and white. He's an idealist, and, it's a well-done example for it of what the positives and negatives of that are being. If I was to compare him to another character at this point, it would probably be Samwise Gamgee, who would say that, if Frodo does something bad, it's just because of the ring, and Frodo is good just because, and when Gollum does something bad, it's because Gollum is bad just because. So Harry has this moment where, deep down he knows that it's bad that Voldemort's parents didn't love him enough to even stick around for him. He even argues with Lupin on this point in Deathly Hallows, but at the same time, it's still Voldemort to him, so he doesn't want to feel sorry for him. He wants to argue with Dumbledore about it and is saying, well, hey, my mother didn't have a choice on whether or not to stick around for me, and Dumbledore sees this as a perfect learning opportunity for Harry as he tries to bridge the gap between these two. Your mother had a choice too, said Dumbledore gently. Yes, Merope Riddle chose death in spite of a son who needed her, but do not judge her too harshly, Harry. She was greatly weakened by long suffering, and she never had your mother's courage. And I just want to reiterate that I don't think that Dumbledore is trying to redeem Voldemort in a traditional sense here, where he's going to have a change of heart and be a force for good in the world. I don't think he's doing that here. I think he knows that no matter what, Voldemort is going to die from this, whether he feels remorse or not. So I don't think that's what it is, but I do think that the purpose of these lessons is to continue Harry's education on souls and their value. That it's not worth destroying his own soul even to finish Voldemort, and that all souls have value, even Voldemort's soul has value. And we do know that Harry learns this lesson because in their final duel, he is still trying to save Voldemort's soul, even if he knows that he has to defeat him. Here's the thing about Dumbledore getting these memories. At the earliest, you would think he'd be trying to get them after Voldemort's initial fall. It's possible that he could even be getting them as part of his Horcrux hunt, so not until the diary is destroyed. But I don't think these memories that he's getting really change his beliefs on Voldemort here. If anything, I think it just kind of confirms his own beliefs. So the next question we really have to ask is, what is his initial impression of Voldemort? And to answer that question, I think we need to look at how Dumbledore views the world and what he thinks the most powerful thing is.
Love, Harry.
Okay, so we'll keep that in mind for all of these interactions, but of course I have to mention the first one at Wool's Orphanage, because that first impression that Dumbledore has is that he's intrigued by young Tom Riddle. You know, he's 11 years old, but his powers are already pretty developed, especially for someone with no training, but at the same time, he's also wary of him. You know, he wants to keep an eye out for him, and for others' sake at that too, because he also has shown an ability to be cruel. And as he's showing this memory to Harry, Harry brings up the idea of, like, weren't you worried about the fact that he was a Parseltongue? And Dumbledore just kind of shrugs it off, like, no, not really. What I was worried about was that he was bullying the other kids, that he was stealing from them, and that he supposedly hung a rabbit with magic. You know, that's what I was worried about. You know, he doesn't care about the abilities for it. That's Dumbledore's way of seeing the world. He cares much more about the choices that this young Tom Riddle was making.
To quote the great UCLA college basketball coach, John Obi-Wan Gandalf, "It is our choices, gentlemen, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities."
You know, Ted and Dumbledore are actually pretty similar when you look at them, even with Dumbledore's anger and lead Tasso scaring the people around them. But if I was to pick any one character in fiction to say who is most like Dumbledore, it would be Spider-Man. Click on the card to find out why.
For full details, see my published works.
Even though Dumbledore is worried about a young Tom Riddle, he still lets him go to Hogwarts, and heck, he doesn't even tell the other professors what happened during that first meeting, you know, which then allows Tom to be able to charm all the other professors, which ends up being a pretty big mistake from Dumbledore.
Pretty obvious.
And this mistake leads to a lot of torment for the students of Hogwarts over the next few years, as Tom and his gang are never really able to be tied to any of it, eventually culminating in the death of Moaning Myrtle at the hands of the Basilisk and Hagrid being framed for it. Now, Dumbledore obviously knows that it was Voldemort who did this, evidenced by Hagrid being given the gamekeeper post right away, but here's the thing about Myrtle's death. It was an accident, you know, even when she's telling Harry and Ron about it, it doesn't come across as Voldemort intentionally killing her. So I unlocked the door to tell him to go and use his own toilet, and then I died. I just remember seeing a pair of great big yellow eyes. My whole body sort of seized up, and then I was floating away. So the thing with Myrtle's death here is that Voldemort doesn't know that she's in this bathroom right now. He's just going for the basilisk, and unintentionally she just opens the door and looks it right in the eyes, and that's how she dies. And you know, obviously 50 years later, there's the message written in blood about the Chamber of Secrets being opened again, but Dumbledore is still able to recognize that Mrs. Norris was petrified right away, so he must have some experience with this. So knowing that Myrtle is the only casualty of the basilisk, you have to think there was at least one other student petrified when Tom Riddle originally opened the Chamber of Secrets in 1942. Now, of course, Dumbledore is going to be more worried than ever after Myrtle's death, but if he thinks this is murder, then is he really just going to keep a closer eye on Tom at this point? I mean, this is a huge step if that's what he thinks it is, so to me that doesn't really make a ton of sense. I think it's more likely that he looks at Tom and says, oh, he's still just a kid and he made this mistake. Whatever was in the chamber must have done this, and, you know, I just need to make sure that he doesn't do something this reckless again. But the one missing piece of information that we know that Dumbledore doesn't at this point is that Voldemort has already killed the Riddle family and framed his Uncle Morphin for it. You know, he could still be saying, like, oh, this was the creature who did that. He doesn't know that he's dealing with a murderer at this point. And you know who else has a deadly beast in the castle at this exact time? Hagrid. So he could just be trying to look at it and say, oh, well, maybe it's kind of like Hagrid, misunderstood creatures they are, and that Tom just didn't really fully know what he was dealing with here. It may even be preferable for him to think that, especially when you consider that he's dealing with Grindelwald here, who's at the peak of his powers, and between a dark wizard trying to take over the world and a teenager who's tormenting a school and being reckless, I think it's pretty easy to say who the bigger threat is. And I'm not saying that Voldemort isn't a threat, just that Dumbledore has a much bigger one he has to deal with right now, so it's more convenient for him to think, oh, Tom's just being reckless, and yes, tormenting the school is bad, but I have something else to deal with, because you know who else torments the school a lot in their time? Fred and George. And yes, we all want to make Umbridge's life worse. Everybody hates Umbridge, but at the same time, they still shove Montague into the Vanishing Cabinet, and if Madame Pomfrey can't figure out what's wrong with him, he's gonna have to spend time at St. Mungo's, so they are risking serious bodily injury for him just because he was gonna take house points away. But the difference between them and Voldemort and what Dumbledore is either hoping for or believing is true about Tom Riddle is the same thing that Harry, Ron, and Hermione talk about when they're realizing just how obsessed Fred and George are with the idea of making gold for their joke shop. Yes, but this is the law, said Hermione, looking scared. This isn't some silly school rule. They'll get a lot more than detention for blackmail. So even if Dumbledore wants to believe that this is the same for Voldemort, he's obviously wrong, and this is what makes Voldemort just completely, irredeemably evil. That he had every chance to not become the most evil dark wizard ever, and still didn't do it. And if these examples aren't working for you yet to see why Dumbledore wouldn't be trying to give him every chance, then let's look at Draco. He isn't just a regular bully. He's openly talking about wanting Muggleborns dead as early as a 12-year-old, and he nearly succeeds in killing both Katie Bell and Ron when they were not his intended targets, and even when he finally does succeed in getting to his intended target, Dumbledore still offers him a chance. He still offers to hide him and his family, knowing everything Draco and Lucius have done. No, Draco, said Dumbledore quietly. It is my mercy, and not yours, that matters now. Man, that line goes so hard, and, with the idea of Dumbledore not knowing that Tom Riddle killed his family at the same age that Draco is here, has he really done anything worse than Voldemort did at this same age? At least in Dumbledore's mind. Whether it's opening the Chamber of Secrets or these unsuccessful attempts to kill Dumbledore, Draco and Tom, in Dumbledore's mind, just seem to not care if people die, but they're also not going out of their way to kill people. Just because Draco failed to kill Katie and Ron doesn't make it better or worse than Tom accidentally killing Myrtle, and yet he still offers Draco the chance to switch sides, to offer to help his family still, after all they've done. So I can't imagine any world where Dumbledore is looking at Tom Riddle at Hogwarts and saying, oh yeah, this is a future Dark Lord, I need to dedicate my life to fighting him, and then he goes to Borgin and Burke's after he graduates, and, obviously it's concerning that he's still interested in the dark arts, but this kind of feels like it would almost be like a step down from him, for all the power that he was chasing while he was at school. Tom Riddle is taking a job where he's just buying and selling artifacts, It's not good that they're dark artifacts, to be sure, but I almost have to imagine Dumbledore is relieved seeing that he's not chasing power the same way. But then he disappears, and I have to imagine this just terrifies Dumbledore, especially the unknown of it all. And Then, years go by and he grants him an interview at Hogwarts, one that he has no intent of letting him fill, but he still gives him an interview, and I have to imagine that it's because he wants to see just how bad it's become, especially with the rumors of Lord Voldemort starting to rise, and seeing this distorted version of Voldemort has to confirm all of his worst fears, yet he still talks to him. The two of them don't duel here. He even lets Tom walk around the school to be able to hide the diadem. Even in this conversation, he's kind of just lamenting the fact that he can't scare Voldemort into behaving anymore, and it's almost kind of like he blames himself for what Voldemort is becoming. Then the war begins, and Dumbledore does do everything he can to stop Voldemort from gaining more power, aside from actually trying to kill him himself. And again, I think there's this responsibility that he feels for Voldemort, for how far he has fallen, and that he can't bring himself to do it, and that's why the prophecy comes along, and it almost kind of confirms it for him, that he will not be the one to bring down the Dark Lord, because deep down he just can't bring himself to do it. Even when the two of them duel at the Ministry, he's trying to take him alive. And sure, for the duel in the Ministry, there's the argument that because he already knows the prophecy, he isn't trying to kill Voldemort because he's not the one who's supposed to. And to that I say, he also knows about the Horcruxes, so even if he does kill Voldemort, he's just going to be less than the meanest ghost again. He's not going to be able to fully defeat him, and he knows that. And you could also argue that he doesn't want to damage his soul any further, or at all, and I'd argue that his soul has been damaged since Ariana died, and just because of how responsible he feels for that, and he just can't bring himself to feel responsible for another's death, even Voldemort, and it's because of the fact that he wasn't able to help him as much as I'm sure that he thinks he could have. And to further argue this point, let's remember that he always calls him Tom to his face, and yet when he's not around, he's always calling him Lord Voldemort. Now, the reality is there are two interpretations of this that we can look at, and the first is from The Matrix, where Agent Smith is always calling Neo Mr. Anderson, as if to just taunt him, to say, like, this is who you've always been, and this is who you'll always be.
Why, Mr. Anderson? Why? Why do you persist?
But that's not Dumbledore, so the other one is much more in character for him if we consider the fact that there is one other character in the series who calls Voldemort Tom, and that's Harry. But he only does it in their final duel, as he's trying to convince him to feel remorse so that he can save his soul and not suffer for all of eternity. Now, of course, we don't know for a fact that Dumbledore wanted Voldemort to feel remorse, but at the same time, so many of his lessons to Harry seem to be culminating with this message at the end, that he wants him to know what the value of a soul is, and that if there's one last chance, let's try to save his soul just in case. And you can argue against that fact if you want to, but there is one point in King's Cross still that I think just kind of shows how Dumbledore would be willing to give anybody a chance, and that's the fact that he asks Harry if he himself was any better than Voldemort. Yeah, that guy, the mass-murdering puppet master who led a coup. Dumbledore thinks he's worse than Voldemort. But more than any other piece of evidence, there's one quote from the scene where Harry and Dumbledore are talking in King's Cross that to me sums up perfectly what Dumbledore thinks of Voldemort. Do not pity the dead, Harry. Pity the living. And above all, those who live without love. Dumbledore knows Voldemort better than anybody. He knows that he has no friends, he knows that his family abandoned him, and he knows that he lives without love, and because of that has made every wrong decision. But he still knows that at the end of the day, Voldemort needs to be stopped, that he is too destructive of a force on this world. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't pity him also, that he feels responsible for what Voldemort has become because he failed him. And with Harry, he sees one last chance to teach him the message that he was never able to all those years ago, the value of a whole soul and the power of love. And with that, and with teaching Harry, He wants to give him one last chance to feel remorse, knowing that it will kill him, but will save his soul for all eternity. Because Dumbledore, to his core, always thinks that everyone deserves another chance, and he always wants what's best for everyone, even Voldemort. And that's my take for today, but now I'm going to shift the question to you guys. What do you think that Dumbledore thought of Voldemort? Do you agree with me, or do you disagree with me still? Let me know down below in the comments, and that's all I've got for you guys today. So if you enjoyed, please drop a like, subscribe if you want more like this. I'll see you next time on STV.